Esther chapter 5 is a fascinating chapter because in it Esther presents her request to King Ahasuerus. But it's not the way you or I would have done it. Haman has got the ear of the king and become his chief advisor. And so anybody who is to approach the king on any matter must bring it through Haman. And Haman had taken umbrage at Mordecai the Jew, evidently a long-seated racial hatred of all Jews. So he has orchestrated to have King Ahasuerus sign a decree that on the 13th day of the 12th month, all the enemies of the Jews can attack the Jews, kill them, indeed are to kill them, and to take their property. And this has been promulgated as a law throughout the whole kingdom, because God has distributed his people for their safety among the nations. But this law will track them down wherever they are, to destroy them, which has been Satan's long-term purpose and repeated goal time and time again. But unbeknownst to Haman and the king, Esther is a Jew, and she is the only one who can speak to the king independently of the line of Haman. But she does that in a completely different role. She knows that her husband, King Ahasuerus, is taken to fits of anger. He is a bit paranoid, evidently. He had dealt with the previous queen very harshly. So, if you're in his good books, you're in his good books, but if you're in his bad books, then there's no hope for you. He has absolute power. And so she has to be very careful about the way that she raises this matter with the king, giving him complete honour and complete control at every stage of the process. So we read, "It happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favour in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden sceptre that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the sceptre. And the king said to her, 'What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom.' So Esther answered, 'If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him.' Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said.' So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, 'What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done.' Then Esther answered and said, 'My petition and request is this. If I have found favour in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said.' So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, 'Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate.' Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we read the next instalment from Esther chapter 5. So Esther has not been in the presence of the king for over a month, and she has no right to approach him, but she puts on her royal robes, having fasted for 3 days, and goes into the court and stands where the king can see her. And the king is in one of his happier moods, and he reaches out his golden sceptre and receives Esther. So she comes near and touches the top of the sceptre. Now, nobody ever came before the king unless they had a request. And so Esther would not have come unless she had a request. "What is your request?" he asks. "I'll give you half the kingdom." He's obviously in a good mood, being very generous this day. But Esther doesn't ask for half the kingdom. She just asks that the king and Haman come to a banquet. We've already seen the king likes his banquets. He'd had a 6-month celebration and a seven-day celebration 10 years earlier, and he'd had a major celebration 5 years earlier when Esther became queen. So now he's delighted to accept the invitation for another banquet, and to bring Haman along as well. What are they going to talk about at the banquet? Well, Esther obviously is a pretty smart woman, and she makes the banquet a very enjoyable event. But in the midst of it all, the king says, "Well, what do you really want? What is your petition? I'll give it to you, up to half the kingdom." But she still doesn't tell him. She still plays with him, because, as it were in the fishing parlance, this is a big fish, and you don't want to pull too hard, or you might lose it. And so her request is that they come again to another banquet the next day. She's not in a hurry, for ultimately what she needs to do is to come to a situation where Haman will show his hand. Haman will do something or say something that reveals what's happening. And Esther is providing that opportunity. And how many times is she going to do this until that happens? Of course, all this has fed into Haman with his ambitions, and he goes home with a glad heart. Here, his obvious goal is to be king himself one day. So here he is, honoured above everybody else, and this honour has even been recognised by the queen, so that in his eyes, the queen, in inviting the king, has invited Haman because the queen recognises Haman is as important as the king. Of course, he's fooling himself. He's living in a fool's paradise. But he goes home thinking this, and calls his friends and celebrates the honours that have been given to him. But on the way he saw Mordecai, and this really riled him. This joy of being elevated. But there was one person who would not honour him. And so he says, "All this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Well, they all have a suggestion. Build some gallows tonight, and in the morning go and have Mordecai hanged. If you're on such good terms with the king, then the king will grant your request, and then there won't be anything to stop your elevation as you go to the banquet. Are the plans of Mordecai and Esther going to fall apart? Will Mordecai be killed before Esther can present her petition?